All right. So we'll go ahead and do a brief introduction of the Humans and Wildlife Speaker Series. We're really thankful to have Dr. Arthur Middleton here with us today. This speaker series kind of came out of redoing the Little Wob exhibit to match Big Joe, who you can see behind me. And when we were researching for the new exhibit, we found that there were a lot of avenues that we couldn't explore. And we wanted to have a platform where we could do that. And so this speaker series is kind of like a prolonged exhibit opening for Little Wob and Big Joe. And a lot of us aren't really current on what scientific research is being done in our own backyard. And we don't necessarily think of how our experiences with wildlife are similar to those of people in other parts of the world. And so this speaker series is going to explore that in both time and space. So last week we had Brian Bouvet here, and he talked about the history of conservation in Park County. And we're gonna have another history presentation in August on whaling. And our next speaker series is about tigers, which is something we probably don't think about very often, but there are a lot of similarities between how people deal with tigers and how they're compensated for damages caused by tigers and grizzlies and wolves and such. So a couple bits of housekeeping. At the bottom of your screen, if you're seeing this on Zoom, you'll see that there's a Q&A box throughout the presentation. If you have any questions, put them in there. Alex and I will monitor those, and at the end of the presentation, we'll ask Dr. Middleton those questions. Once you exit Zoom, you will be prompted to fill out a survey. If you're watching this on Facebook, Alex will put that in the comments there. And that just helps us when we're developing more programming to do what interests you. So I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Middleton, and then we'll get started. Dr. Middleton is an assistant professor of wildlife management and policy at the University of California, Berkeley. His earliest work with wildlife was as a falconer and raptor biologist, and then he later pursued graduate training in environmental management at Yale University and in ecology at the University of Wyoming. He then trained as a postdoctoral fellow at Yale and joined the Department of Environmental Science, Policy and Management at UC Berkeley in 2006. He currently serves as a trustee and a research associate of our friends, the Buffalo Bills Center of the West, and is a science advisor to the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation. In the summers, Dr. Middleton and his family live in Cody, where he conducts much of his field research. So thanks for being here with us today.
Thank you, Amy. And first, can you hear me?
Yes.
And can you see my slides?
We can see your slides and hear you.
Okay, great. In this virtual world, it's always good to check on those essentials. Well, thanks, Amy, and thanks to the Meeteetse Museum and the community of support around the museum. It's one of my favorite places locally to visit. As Amy mentioned, I spend the summers and sometimes other parts of the year in Cody, not far from Meeteetse, and I bring visitors pretty frequently down to Meeteetse into the museum, and so it's a wonderful opportunity to connect with the community there. I just wish that we were able to do it in person. I'm sorry I won't get to be with you in person and converse more, but maybe this means I'll be able to be invited back one day when we can actually get together. Just a technical note, I'm working from my laptop here this evening, and annoyingly, the camera is down on the bottom left of my screen. So I'm looking at you now, but the rest of the time I'll probably be looking a little bit above and right of you. And sorry, it's a little funny if you're actually looking at me. Well, I want to talk this evening about a part of my research program, which I actually started when I was a graduate student at the University of Wyoming, working on the Clarks Fork Elkhart, northwest of Cody, and that evolved and expanded through my postdoc years, and then much more so once I became a faculty member at the University of California. And we work on a number of things. We generally work on wide-ranging wildlife, large mammals, and terrestrial ecosystems, because we're interested in the disproportionate effects these critters have ecologically, but also we recognize that because of what they eat and where they roam and the distances they travel, these are species that get into conflict and with people. And so we're also interested in that dimension of these large mammals. And so this evening, I'm going to talk about a part of my program that I'm especially passionate about, which is ungulate migrations in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And I'm especially passionate about this part of my program because I think it's an important way to understand this ecosystem, the landscape that most of us are sitting in or standing, in my case, in as we speak. And also has a potential to show us some new ways of thinking about conservation, not just of these species, but of the whole landscape. And so as a scientist, it's just really exciting to be able to work on this kind of multi-dimensional science and conservation story that is the migratory ungulates of the greater Yellowstone. I'm really always, bad at the end of my talks at making acknowledgements because there's questions and there's distractions. And so I just thought I'd say right up front, I've been working around here for, I think, about 13 years now. And over that period of time, I've been fortunate to gain the support and collaboration and cooperation and partnership of a lot of research colleagues and agencies and nonprofits and others. And so I just want to say a general thank you and acknowledgement to many of these folks that span the agencies you see at the top, the state and federal wildlife agencies and land management agencies in the region, some of the primary funders of my program, from National Geographic and the Buffalo Bill Center to some of the foundations here, as well as many individual donors around the community. So nothing I'm going to talk about would be possible without really broad support that I've been fortunate to have over the years, especially from the community in Northwest Wyoming. So it's sort of a quick roadmap for what I want to talk about. First of all, what's the fuss? What's been driving this recent interest in ungulate migrations, wildlife migrations, but ungulate migrations in particular? And second, what are those species and what are their migrations around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem? And third, I just want to zoom in, since I am talking to folks right here in Meeteetse and Cody about migratory ungulates in the eastern portion of the system and some general thinking about their conservation. So really, over the past few decades in ecology, which is the field I'm trained in and work in, to conservation science, to conservation practice, there's been a really rapidly growing sense that connectivity of populations and across landscapes is important very broadly in terms of sustaining biodiversity. It's important for the daily, at the scale of daily movements of many species, of seasonal migrations like the ones I'm going to focus on, of gene flow over much larger spaces and time and spatial scales. And it's important because it's part of how populations sustain themselves and get their food and reproduce at high rates. It's important as populations adapt to changing environment, including a changing climate over space and time. And so everything I'm going to talk about is situated in this broad movement toward understanding the importance of connectivity in my field and in conservation. But there's been this specific and rapidly growing interest within that in understanding ungulate migrations in particular, and in conserving them. I'm showing you here a slide that has pictures of wildebeest and zebra and the famous Serengeti multi-species migrations in savanna and Africa, or barren ground caribou up in the northern reaches of North America. We could think about many other examples. And the interest in these has been growing, I think, for a number of reasons. One is just we're aware that we as humans are rapidly and dramatically changing landscapes globally, and we have concern about how that's changing patterns of wildlife movement and population viability. Tracking technology has just blown up, along the same kind of, just in a bit of a lag behind when you got a cell phone and when your computer became tiny and when you could start holding a GPS unit in your hand every time you wanted to get in the backcountry. Not long after that, with every development, there's a new development in wildlife tracking technology that uses those same advancements. And so we can now get very detailed information on these animals that we study on a very frequent basis across many individuals and populations. Remote sensing satellites that can take detailed pictures of the Earth, we can relate that movement information now to features of landscapes to understand the habitat needs and the sensitivities of animals to their environment. And I think importantly, but sometimes overlooked, is just the sort of democratization and the much greater ease with which people can tell stories and share stories. And so as the science has advanced, people have used digital cameras and trail cameras and all this technology to tell those stories much more quickly and to many more people. Just as an example of these rapid developments in tracking and remote sensing, here I'm showing you just in two quick maps that two of the longest known land migrations known to occur respectively in Africa and in the lower 48 US states have been discovered in just the past decade. This is a zebra migration in Botswana and Zambia on the left, and the now well-known red desert to hoback mule deer migration in western Wyoming. And so just in the past 10 years, these extraordinary discoveries of these long distance animal movements right under our noses involving thousands of animals. And this has led to a lot of excitement and interest in the science and conservation communities. A growing recognition of the importance of the entire year-round range. And I can't emphasize this enough. For many decades, science and conservation involving these migratory hoofed mammals or ungulates has tended to focus on the winter ranges in particular, where they spend the winter, and sometimes the summer ranges, because we kind of just didn't really see in much detail the space in between. But now with this technology, tracking and remote sensing, we can see those routes and the corridors these animals use and why they're important in incredible detail. And so now we don't just think about these seasonal ranges that bookend the corridors, but we can see that the corridors themselves, the stopover habitats within those corridors where some of these elk and deer and other species stop to give birth, to forage along the way, to rest, to gain refuge from predators or hunters, that those are critically important. And another piece of this here is what this advances in technology and our analytic capabilities have allowed is we're not any longer just stuck connecting the dots along a route or a corridor, but now we can actually map a two-dimensional surface, that has an area around it on the landscape based on how far the animal moved, what its turning angles were, how quickly it was moving. And that suddenly means we go from information that's hardly useful for land managers and wildlife managers to suddenly it's really useful because it's a spatial area that you can focus on. By the way, I should have told you that this map on the bottom right is just this is one female mule deer moving across a landscape in Wyoming from her winter range through a migration corridor, stopping over there at the top of the figure, making a few other stops to forage, and then arriving at her summer range. And I should add that mule deer in several Wyoming populations are now known to spend as much as a third of their entire year in the migration corridor. And so again, suddenly this habitat is considered much more important than ever before. There's a much greater awareness of the importance of these migratory ungulates to ecosystems. There's a picture that really pops it out because the Serengeti wildebeest are just simply so incredibly abundant. You see here just a river crossing that these animals make where routinely on the migration, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individuals just trample on top of each other, drown each other in rivers. And then that is just amounts to a huge pulse of nutrients into those river systems that can be measured by scientists in the plants and the animals that inhabit those river systems. And so just one example of this awareness that these migrations mean a lot in the ecosystems that they inhabit. And again, this growing and public interest. Think of National Geographic with its millions of readers in recent years, shining a light on great migrations and drawing much more public interest to these phenomena. Or on the right, I'm just showing you a screenshot of a film that my colleague Hal Sawyer and my friend and collaborator Joe Reese, a wildlife photographer, some of you may be familiar with from his work around here, made a short film about 5 minutes long. Some of you may have seen it. Joe, if he were here, would say, never did I imagine that more than a few tens of thousands of people would watch this max. But now it's been seen 7.6 million times as of just the other day. So really surprising interest in this phenomenon, even in this region where we now sit. And I think that this combination of these scientific advances combined with better and more impactful storytelling and growing public interest is why we're now seeing federal and state and nonprofit, interest in, trying to come up with solutions where migratory ungulates do run into threats and challenges. So on the left, this is former Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke being presented at National Geographic with a map that we made of the elk migrations of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Not long before he ordered agencies in the Department of Interior to work with states and private entities to conserve big game corridors and seasonal ranges in the West. Or some of you may be aware that the Wyoming Game and Fish Commission and more recently Wyoming's governor have shone a light on the importance of corridors in Wyoming and created an order and a strategy for agencies to work together and work with the private sector to protect, in this case, pronghorn and mule deer migration corridors. Just two examples of the sort of policy response to the science and some of the growing public awareness. Okay, so that's kind of what's been driving this growing interest. But what about the particular migratory ungulates of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem? Here, as I'm sure almost everyone I'm talking to right now knows, there are 6 species of hoofed mammals, of ungulates, that include populations that migrate or are partially migratory with the seasons: elk, mule deer, pronghorn, antelope, bison, bighorn sheep, and moose. These are the native migratory ungulates of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And migrants may range as little as 15 miles, as far as a couple hundred miles for some mule deer, twice a year. Distance doesn't matter so much, as when we're talking about migration, we mean this movement between totally separate and distinct seasonal ranges. Winter ranges and summer ranges are in different places and different habitats. There's been these long-standing hypotheses for, why do these animals migrate? It's been a kind of a vexing question for many years in many species, and for a long time it's been posed, but hard to measure, that these ungulates are generally migrating to get a longer period of access to high-quality forage. And so this is kind of intuitive when we see it, and we see it around the landscape, but people have been trying to measure and document and validate and get a better understanding of this. A second reason is potentially a reduced risk of predation. So the idea here being that when these grazing herbivores, these ungulates, move away to get better food, as the snow melts up the mountain in the spring, that their predators, in this case, I'm giving the example of the wolf, is left still associated with its den and its pups down closer to the winter range. So there may be this fleeting benefit of moving away to the summer range in terms of a brief respite from predation from denning predators. The one of these that's much favored and better studied is this prolonged access to high quality forage. And one of the ways that we measure this is with satellite imagery that can now, at a very fine resolution, help us document and quantify greenness, essentially the amount of chlorophyll and greenness on landscapes. And so we used what's called normalized difference vegetation index, which is just a really fancy way of talking about greenness, to look at the changes across landscapes in vegetation emergence, growth, and senescence. And what we're talking about here is the forage maturation and the green wave hypotheses in ecology. And you'll often hear these talked about as ungulates are surfing the green wave. So I just want to show you briefly some work led by a colleague of mine, Jared Merkel, that looked at most of these species, or 4 out of these 6 anyway, in the Rockies, and asked, are they really tracking the green wave well? How well? Do they succeed at that? Is it really what's driving them to move across the landscape? And so he had 7 herds with hundreds of individuals across deer, sheep, moose, and bison populations, tracked pretty recently. And what Jared was doing here was, and I'm not going to show you many charts, I promise, in this talk, but here's one where that black line is really just what the greenness on the landscape is over the course of the season. So in the spring, it's not green because there's still snow, but then it starts greening up, and then you get maximum greenness in the summer, and then it browns down again into the autumn. And what we're interested in is the place when the landscape's greening up, where that's happening most rapidly, the maximum rate of green up. And when you look at these little 30-meter pixels across the landscape, you can say, does this individual ungulate across, and do all of these individuals across these populations and species, track with that flush of green across all those pixels across the landscape in that when we look at those remotely sensed images? And the answer is, for the most part, yes. So this is just showing you that at peak green up, that's when you see most of these populations and most of these species hitting those different patches across the landscape. So there's really strong evidence coming out that indeed this is really the main driver of these migrations through the spring and the summer. I was really interested when I was working on the Clark's Fork herd in the question of whether and how this green wave tracking might influence actually, okay, so these animals do it, but what benefit do they get from it? Does it actually help them get fatter? And so we looked at this in some elk just north and west of Cody. The partially migratory Clark's Fork herds, about 4,000 individuals, about half migrant at that time, half resident, where the migrants move up into the upper Lamar inside Yellowstone Park for the summer at those higher elevations. And so we had about 90 GPS collared individuals where for most of them we were getting body fat estimates when we caught them to recollar them at the end of the summer. And we could link the kind of stuff I just showed you from Jared's work to the body fat estimates in summer and autumn for these elk cows that were estimated with through collaboration with my colleagues, John and Rachel Cook. You can see here doing a rapid fat assessment using an ultrasound machine out in the field back during that study. And the kind of information that we get is this body fat data here. So you're just looking at body fat in winter is lower down in the 5 sub 10% range. And then of course it increases through the summer as these animals graze on that good green grass and declines back through the next winter and so forth. And so we're just asking, when these animals like track really closely to that green wave, does that explain, does how closely they track with that explain how fat they get by the end of the summer? And so here's on the top just images about the green up across time in one spring. So you can see the migrants in black. And you can see as we move through March and then May and June, that you can see green move up into the mountains across the landscape. And you can see these migratory elk moving basically to track that green wave, whereas the residents in red kind of end up stuck behind in the brown part of the landscape, which is hotter and drier down at the lower elevations. And as some of you probably know, one of the ways they deal with this is by eating irrigated hay and alfalfa and sort of buffering themselves that way. But you see the migrants follow that green flush of native vegetation. Okay, this is one of my only other charts, and it basically just shows you the fewer days behind that green flush an elk is, the fatter she gets. So if she keeps up with the emergence of green grass across the landscape, she can end up quite a bit fatter by the end of the summer. And we saw that many migratory females could gain as much as 15 pounds more fat than resident females, unless the resident cow is on a hay field or an alfalfa field. I'm telling you this because what we're looking at is essentially the building blocks of how animal fat and muscle and biomass gets built in this system. And so if you think about, these migratory females getting more fat on them by the end of the summer, I think about multiplying that over lots and lots of elk and even other species, then migration begins to appear as a real engine of productivity in these populations and in the ecosystem. And so I've been really fascinated by that and interested in at what scale does this occur? At what scale is this important? I was aware of many historical studies and insights about other migratory elk herds, but couldn't really find basically a map or get my head around the scope of this phenomenon. And so I spent a number of years between 2012 and 15, 16, 17, just trying to find out what the other migrations were of elk around the ecosystem and aggregate that information. And so that involves working and developing partnerships and cooperation with a lot of agencies and federal and state agencies and other university researchers around the system. But it turned out there was a lot of this information. It just wasn't being aggregated in one place and studied, at this larger scale of the larger landscape and ecosystem. And so we did that. That information base is still growing. Where we've found gaps, sometimes we've gone out, including in Cody and in Gooseberry herd and down in Wigginsford by Du Bois. Those are all examples of where we got the existing data and then found gaps, and then we went and did new capture work and documented migrations that weren't well documented or documented in detail before. And so this is a picture of what that began to look like. And this is a little bit out of date now. If it were up to date, you'd see that area in Idaho southwest of Yellowstone Park you'd see some migratory movements of elk there, and you'd see some more data up in the Beartooth in Montana. But this is these are the migratory movements of about 5 or 10 elk cows in each of these major herds around the sort of core of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And so these movements represent something probably like 20 to 25,000 females in these aggregated herds that migrate each spring and fall, in and back out of these core areas. Migration distances from 10 up to 125 miles, depending on which herd and which individual. On average, they're leaving about May 11th, but there's a lot of variability there depending on when the snow melts and when the green up occurs, of course, and when an elk cow gives birth and where. Average fall departure is about November 2nd. One of our recent studies, we've seen that date has grown much later in recent years. So since about 2000, that date has drifted much later into late November by somewhere between 40 and 50 days later, which we don't understand well. It may relate to snow depths. It may relate to changes in hunting pressure down on winter ranges. We still have work to do to understand that better. But this is what strikes me about this is just that we're looking here at the movements of something like 10 to 12 million, just back of the envelope, pounds of animal tissue, biomass that's pulsing in and out of these core areas seasonally in the ecosystem. And so, again, building on this idea of this productivity, this fat gain and reproductive output that occurs because of migratory behavior. It's really important. And for me, this became a new way of thinking about this as an ecological system and as a landscape, where these elk and other migratory ungulates are really, of course, they're you see them around. They seem kind of a dime a dozen, but maybe don't often think about the great importance that they have in driving so much about the system, whether that's the the food that carnivores and scavengers have available to them in wilderness, or the tourism that directly and indirectly is drawn to them, or the harvest and its economic consequences. that's associated with them. And that's, elk are particularly important to that, but that this is really a multi-species phenomenon that we're still in the process of understanding and mapping and responding to in terms of management and science and policy. And to really get into why this seems so important, is I want to go back to this slide, these migrations of elk and green, and pronghorn in this rust color, and mule deer in this purple color. And I just grabbed two key pronghorn and a key mule deer population. Of course, if we had all of these studied and mapped, it would be sort of overwhelming to map all of these on the map. But let's take these and then just look at the jurisdictional ribbons that are associated with their movements on migration each year. Look at the pronghorn migration that was on that map, or the mule deer migration just below, or these 9 elk herds below that. And you can see in these different colors that are keyed there to different ownerships and jurisdictions on the bottom, how many players have to be doing sort of the right thing for these migrations to persist. And in particular, I've been interested in the importance of private lands. I mean, to pop out why that seems so important, how many Yellowstone Park visitors from wherever, Ohio or California, understand that an elk that they see, or a wolf or a bear that they see that depends on elk inside the park, that they have a private landowner or a set of partnerships far outside the park boundary to appreciate, really, or to try and understand, that's part of sort of serving up that experience that they get from visiting the park. And so, for instance, with the mule deer migration, there's at least 48 private landowners that are along that path. For these elk herds, it's really the winter ranges. 20 to 80% of the time these herds spend in winters on private lands. And so these private lands provide these extraordinary resources, and not just private lands, but nearby multi-use public lands to these herds. But of course, they also are used for lots of other purposes, and that can create challenges and risks and threats for some of these migratory populations. And those encompass residential development, energy development, agricultural conflicts like disease spillover to cattle that reduces tolerance for these populations, nutritional subsidies that can affect these migrations, and also involve conflict because these animals are in crops, fences, roads. And I will quickly run through several of these, but then I'll drill a little further into the barriers and the fences and the roads. Residential development is of course variable all around the system, and it's varied in history and as well as in space. So here are elk at the National Elk Refuge in Jackson on the top of the slide, really having ended up there because development of the Jackson town site and surrounding areas snarfed up stopover habitat in a winter range that this huge migratory herd formerly depended on. Or more recently, one could come up with a number of different examples around Cody or any other part of the ecosystem of this slow creep of development. Agricultural conflicts where particularly migratory elk, but also of course antelope and others, are getting into irrigated fields and crops that both affect them by subsidizing them to not migrate, and also carry costs for agricultural producers, or commingling with cattle and and spilling over brucellosis in particular to cattle, which can be incredibly costly and challenging for ranchers around the system, and is increasingly so as the rates of seroprevalence and seemingly infection by brucellosis around the system increase gradually. And as I said, I wanted to drill a little further into barriers like fences and roads that can be very important to these populations. I have a student, Wenjing Zhu, who's pictured here at the top left, who has been working with my colleague Hal Sawyer on with a large data set from pronghorn movements in the Green River Basin, and may help us a little bit on future work in Cody on the Carter Mountain pronghorn herd. But what Wenjing has done is really said, okay, let's get more into the details now that we have this GPS data and we can map fences of how these animals respond to fences. And so she's identified, that the behaviors you see here, they can just quickly get across. They can forage near fences and do what they need to do in what she called normal movements without any consequence. But then they also bounce away from fences, having not found a way to cross. They trace along fences for long distances, looking for a place to cross. Or they might move back and forth shorter distances doing the same. And they might sometimes in areas with high fence densities get trapped and not really be able to do what they need to do. And I'll just quickly show you this animation from the Green River Basin where Wenjing's essentially animating those behavior responses across 10 pronghorn as they're bopping around and gradually moving in their migratory movements to the north of the study area. But you can see that they're very often engaged in one of these behaviors in this landscape, not surprisingly, because in Sublette County, Wenjing pulled together all the available fence data and then used satellite images to expand on the available data and painstakingly look at high resolution satellite maps and digitized fences. We're talking about in this part of Sublette County, about something like 4,000 miles of fences, which is more than twice the length of the US-Mexico border. And what's the point of all this work? Well, when agencies and landowners and others interested in improving the landscape for these critters seek to do that, when there's as much fencing out there as there is, it's important to have tools to identify the problem fences and prioritize their modification. And so Wenjing's been working on this tool that's sort of just giving a snapshot on the right that where the fences that get the most non-crossing behaviors are highlighted. And so this may be a potential tool down the road for prioritizing fences for remediation. But one wonders, just thinking about this relatively small project in one part of Wyoming, just about the extent of wildlife responses to fencing, all around the globe, if that's what it is in this corner of Wyoming. Roads and fences come up in the case of the Red Desert to Hoback migration. Here's some work I contributed to with my colleague Hal Sawyer in the lead, where Hal, who documented this migration, said, hey, you know what, there's short distance migrants, there's medium distance migrants, they're in the rust color, and there are these long distance migrants in the herd in the purple color. And this seems like an opportunity to look into whether the long distance migrants, experience more hazard and encounter more hazards on the landscape. And indeed, that's what we saw. So short distance migrants don't need to deal with highways. They don't need to deal with fences. They're in one hunt area, so they aren't exposed to that much hunting. Whereas the longer the migration, the more highway crossings with mortality risk, the more fences, 170 fences that these long distance deer had to cross. And they move through multiple hunt areas in the fall. So I felt like this study really gives you a window into how we very gradually, lose the longer distance migrants in these migratory populations. And my artist friend James Prozek's way of depicting this sort of idea of just a slow, boxing in of a migratory system was this Yellowstone wilderness in a box image that now is part of the collection at the Buffalo Bill Center of the West, where he was sort of doing this thought experiment. Imagine if this national park had a wall around it and none of the migratory species could get out or get in with the seasons. And so for all of these reasons, I've felt it's important to kind of, to not just do the science, but sort of tell the story of these migrations, why they're important, what some of the challenges they face are. So we've done some of that work with National Geographic. For me, sometimes that's meant writing or collaborating with photographers to create more creative products and raise awareness. One of the funnest was a museum exhibit called Invisible Boundaries that we made with the Buffalo Bill Center in Cody several years ago, and which has traveled a number of places around the country. And I'd like to think that this combination of unpacking, the science of these migrations, but then also telling their story, kind of can help pick up, it can kind of help stimulate some of the on-the-ground efforts that are already happening, the highway crossings, the fence modifications, habitat projects, whether it's easements or, habitat treatments to enhance habitat. They're already happening, but that we probably need to happen at a faster scale and a larger scale to really, get where we want to be with some of these populations and landscapes. I want to use my remaining time just to talk a little bit about migratory ungulates and private lands in eastern GYE. And some of this is pretty fresh information. I'm combining together data from the Cody elk herd, which is in green here. You can see animals that migrate between the North Fork, the South Fork, and the Gray Bull, and the thoroughfare and that high country. You can see mule deer from the Shoshone herds making similar movements as far as Grand Teton National Park for the summer. And then some really new information from a study led by my colleague Hal Sawyer with the Game and Fish Department, looking at the Carter Mountain pronghorn herd that moves between parts of the Bighorn Basin and up into the areas around and on Carter Mountain and south in the summer. So that's a brand new study, and this is only showing you a little bit of data from those pronghorn movements. But this really pops out for you why early managers of Yellowstone National Park, within just a few years after 1872, when the park was established, realized it's too small. Some of the most important wildlife, go so far to the east and the south that the park should have been bigger. And of course, that never happened, and that's never going to happen. But it seems like there's been this long kind of effort to try and conserve these wildlife and these movements and other means, the national forests, game laws, and other approaches. Now, I would say an important frontier being trying to do better in supporting private landowners and conducting conservation on private land, so that it's easier for landowners to be part of conservation efforts with these kinds of populations. I have a little box on the map there by Cody Elk, that little red box, just to give those of you who haven't had a chance to get into this backcountry a sense of why these migrations, particularly of the Cody elk herd and the upper Shoshone deer herd, are so extraordinary, and why I think of them as a national treasure and a real natural wonder. You know, this is just one little swatch of the migration route of the Cody elk herd as they move from the Grable to the thoroughfare. And hopefully by now, a few of you have spotted the 8 cow elk in the middle of this photograph that Joe Reese took. Probably at about 11,000 feet on their way up to one of their 3 high passes that they've got across. And if you're Joe, I just want to point out, you got to get your trail camera within 2 feet of those animals. So it's really an, you know, incredible skill set that Joe has. And then this is what happens to a lot of the cameras. But, you know, eventually over the course of several years, you know, Joe really has just brought back extraordinary footage and photographs here. A little group of cow elk at about 11,500 feet in the clouds. These are practically Matitsi elk, but they're up in the clouds, having taken a wrong turn, and you saw the lead cow there sort of trying to find her way back to the trail. Big swollen rivers in the spring that these big groups have to get across and get their calves across in many cases. There's a little calf, maybe 3 or 4 weeks old, having just made its river crossing there on the South Fork on the way, probably by evening, going to be in the thoroughfare. And of course, you know, just like anywhere around the system, there are questions of, you know, development and how we're going to use the landscape and what we're going to do with it. And the South Fork and the North Fork and perhaps the Grable are no different, maybe a little bit lower development pressure than some other areas of the ecosystem. But I don't have the answer to this, but clearly something that many of us are going to need to think about in thinking about how to make sure we sustain these migrations in the longer term. But I think a deeper problem than just saying, okay, there's development and it's bad, you know, for some of these populations is, you know, what are the drivers of why we end up with subdivision in some cases? And it's not entirely the following, but certainly part of it is the challenges that this wildlife system poses for kind of eking out either a living or paying for the management of private lands at a large scale. And so, you know, as many of you probably know, maybe even experience, I don't know who else in the audience, but you commonly hear, you know, when these big migratory elk herds and sometimes deer come down out of the mountains, they're hungry, they've got diseases, they've got predators, they knock down fences, everybody wants to come hunt them, cut the fence down, and all of this. And this is happening on ranches and on properties that already have all these other wildlife species. The most diverse large mammal assemblage anywhere in North America, all the large carnivores, pretty much all the migratory ungulates, sage grouse, Yellowstone cutthroats, black-footed ferrets, and so on. And so I don't have the answer. I'm just a, you know, an ecologist, but it certainly seems to me that this is really going to be a major challenge to figure out how to make it sort of easier to sustain these wildlife without not being able to make money or make a living into the future. My friends at the Western Landowners Alliance said, let me borrow a few slides. And one of the ways they think about this is, you know, the typical process is we identify a corridor, NGOs and scientists are part of that, agencies are, and then we say, God, just like I have, there's development, there's roads, there's fences, there's livestock, there's energy. in what ways are these problems for these herds? We make plans to protect the corridor. That comes with all these restrictions, housing, development restrictions, land use restrictions, fencing restrictions, grazing restrictions, and so forth. And what folks are really starting to try and do better at and do some deeper thinking about, and some of this work's already been done in many parts of the West, but what if instead we started by identifying why wildlife are in this corridor? What's going right? Well, there's intact private lands. There's refuge there for wildlife from some of the pressure they receive on public lands. Maybe there's economic activity that's supporting livelihoods and community while still leaving room for wildlife. And so you start thinking about how to sustain, what's going right, funding and support for easements, support for collaborative conservation, technical assistance, economic benefits associated with these kinds of populations. And so I don't, it's not my expertise, but I think it's a really important way that people are starting to try and think about corridors, perhaps a little too late, but I think increasingly we're going to see some of these more proactive and collaborative efforts expanding. I hope we will on the landscape. So some parting observations for me, just, I'm going to make the case to you that these ungulate migrations are really perhaps one of the most important phenomena to the fabric of this ecosystem that we're all part of. They seem really important to sustaining a bunch of things that we care about, but don't always, mentally link to the migrations, whether that's other species that depend on them or economic activities that depend on them. And that protecting these migrations is really going to require us to have some new thinking, some innovations in collaborative and voluntary conservation, particularly where it comes to private lands. And we're not there yet in many respects, or we're not there yet at the scale that we want to be or need to be. And just in the spirit of mentioning innovation, this is why, I've increasingly sort of migrated out of my comfort zone as a natural scientist and tried to do a little bit more work on policy and management. And so my friend and Albert Summers, who's a state legislator here in Wyoming from Sublette County, has said, hey, you know what? A lot of people go to visit Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. Increasingly, they want to go to those because of the wildlife, but they're not really, even though they deposit money in this landscape, most of that money doesn't go back to those who are carrying the costs of conservation. And so Albert proposed, just through a resolution, a conservation fee that would be attached to the entry to the national parks that would then be streamed back out into the larger landscape to help fund corridor conservation or to help pay for wildlife damage compensation and so forth. And so I just leave you with this as a parting example of kind of, I don't know whether this will gain traction. We've done a bit of research to explore it with some lawyers and some economists. But it's just an example of sort of the broadening our thinking and trying to come up with some new models about how we can drive the kind of large landscape partnerships and collaborations that we might need if we're going to secure the landscape for these wide-ranging wildlife. So with that, I am going to thank all my various funders and supporters and partners and collaborators from over the years. And I'm happy to answer questions if there are some. Thanks.
We do have quite a few questions. So the first one is that why did white-tailed deer not make the list of native migratory ungulates in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem? The question asker notes that they have seen them in Yellowstone in the spring.
Mm-hmm. Maybe they should. You know, it seems like people sort of bicker over how many white-tailed deer have, you know, been in the system, and then, you know, to what degree, I guess, maybe more importantly, you know, to what degree they make these seasonal movements. And I'm going to say that even though I should know the answers to those questions, I'm just not. I haven't worked on white-tailed deer, and I haven't, you know, been a part of that discussion. So maybe in the future we need to take a closer look.
And then this one was when you were talking about the Clark's Fork elk. Are they either resident or migratory as individuals, or will one elk shift based on circumstances and 1 year stay as a resident and another year migrate? That
is a really good question, and it really hits home because we're working on it right now. And I would say that it's a question that I feel I've been perhaps well, let me step back and say about 10 years ago when we were reporting out of the Clark's Fork herd, I was asked that question quite a bit. And I would say, if they're migratory, they're migratory. If they're resident, they don't ever switch. And I was saying that because we collared, you know, 120 individuals over 4 years. And we didn't see cases of that switching, you know, year to year between migratory and resident behavior by individual. But since then, since then, I've sort of been criticized and thought harder about it myself. And sort of what that boils down to is that's not a very big, that's still a fairly small sample of a big population of animals. So there could be a low rate of that switching that you just never document with your collared animals. And so what we're trying to do now is marshal a much larger body of data from across a lot of these herds to try and get at this question more closely. And in the preliminary sort of results, it does look like we see something like a 10% or so rate of switching year to year. It's really a challenge to answer the question because it's actually quite hard to long distance migrants are really clearly definable, and pure residents are clearly definable, but there's this kind of middle confusing, you know, type of individual that makes it hard for us to make these distinctions. And so we're working through that in a big analysis now. And I'm guessing it's going to say, yeah, 5-10% of the time individuals do switch. And hopefully we'll be able to pin down some of the circumstances, like, you know, heavy snow years where it's hard to migrate, or great feed that means it's better to be resident.
And then this one says, there seem to be fewer lactating females in the migratory elk groups than resident. Was this a factor of the sampling, or, to follow the previous question, do animals need to trade off having calves and moving these distances?
Yeah, that's a great, I mean, it's like there's researchers planted in the, you know, who know this work, planted in the audience. It's a really good question. And it was a real challenge in that study because of essentially grizzly bears, but also black bears and wolves, but especially grizzly bears. There ain't a whole lot of lactating female elk by the time autumn comes around in these populations. So it's in the Clark's Fork herd. And that's because calves get eaten when they're pretty young particularly by bears, but also other predators. And so we tried hard to get, lactating cows and augment the sample, but it still was a challenge for some of that work. Nevertheless, what we found was pretty good evidence, even comparing, lactators to lactators between the migrants and residents, that there was a benefit to being a migrant. But to answer the second part of that question, yes, we saw evidence that cow elk, I think it was about 15% of cow elk skipped years. So if they were still had their calf at heel by mid-autumn, and then we sampled them again for pregnancy the following winter, they were not pregnant and they skipped the year. And we attributed that to a really dry, hot summers in the late kind of in 2007, 8, 9, 10 period that was probably making it hard for a female with a calf to both nurse that calf and gain enough fat, and condition to become pregnant again.
And then related to calves, this person said they're just joining, but what's your opinion on the high calf mortality rate and the sustainability of the greater Yellowstone elk herd?
Well, what's my opinion? I mean, I can tell you I've studied a number of questions directly or indirectly related to this. And first of all, it's really variable around the system. And so we have some herds that, are declining and maybe they're not any longer declining. Well, in response to those declines, harvest has been, dialed back. And so now you have stable herds, but there's a lot less hunting opportunity because essentially you're sharing, fewer elk among more predators, including people. Then you have other herds that have been increasing and that have almost just as many carnivores and still sustain, a pretty robust hunting harvest. So it depends on which, the north part, east side, south side, west side of the ecosystem and which herd you're talking about. But the calf numbers are, of course, really important as this person has alluded to that equation. On the one hand, these elk, particularly migratory elk, have all the large carnivores now again consuming them as they did, just soon after the Pleistocene extinctions 10,000 years ago, and they have a lot heavier human, harvest than they did at that time. On the other hand, some of these populations, with all of that predation, are doing quite well and are stable. So I'm giving a little bit of a mealy-mouthed answer, but I guess I'm saying predation is significant in many of these herds. In a few cases, that's driven them to a low level. They're not going to blink out or anything. They just can't sustain much human harvest. But then in many other cases, including, I would argue, the Cody elk herd right here in our backyard, that's the population that's still sustaining a good bit of harvest in spite of those high levels of predation. So it depends on where you are in the landscape, probably things like how easy it is for elk to hide from predators, how open the habitat is to allow them to see predators coming and respond, how deep the snow is in the winter, and whether that makes them, especially easy to be hunted by wolves. So all of that matters, and it varies around the landscape, and the outcomes differ in each of the major herds. So I hope that helped with that question.
And then related to the herds, do migratory elk migrate with different herds, or do they go into the summer range with the same herd as they leave the winter range with, and leave for the winter range with?
For the most part, it seems as though they kind of stick together. But kind of like the switching thing, you could ask like any question like this. If anybody ever tells you like, no, that never happens, then then they're probably wrong, because there's sort of low rates of a lot of things that you could imagine. So I wouldn't want to say, no, they never, mix up with another herd on their migration, because we always have evidence that things like that happen, a little bit, especially that thoroughfare region of the ecosystem. It gets elk from the Cody herd, from the Jackson herd, from the Wiggins Fork herd. And we've had recent cases, and this isn't exactly what the question is about, but recent cases where, we've had elk go from Cody to thoroughfare, and then almost everybody comes back from thoroughfare to the winter range, but one cow in our sample goes to Jackson with the Jackson herd. So there's stuff like that goes on. It's just not it's not highly fluid. It's just a little bit fluid.
And then just a reminder to attendees, you can't just raise your hand to ask a question. There's that option, but you'll hit the Q&A box and then type in your question and we'll ask it. And then we've got 2 more questions as of right now. What are factors that your work identifies as the greatest stressor on ungulate migrations in Wyoming, and what are the best supported remediations?
Great question. Since the question is about Wyoming, writ large, I'll kind of zoom out. And I'm also going to define migrations as broader than just the corridors. Sometimes people talk about migrations, they're just talking about the corridors, but I tend to think of it as, the total year-round habitats that are important to a herd. And so clearly, some of the biggest declines of, say, mule deer, which are declining gradually across the West and have become a species of conservation concern, have been high density energy development in parts of the Green River Basin. And so work by my colleague Hal Sawyer has really shown a pretty dramatic decline of deer in portions of the sublet herd. An important caveat there is that those are particularly high density developments. And so, it's not to say that energy development of any kind and anywhere at any density is, going to drive dramatic declines, but that there's some big red flags there, and that energy development has been an important driver of both in terms of loss of habitat, disturbance, leading to indirect habitat loss, and then also barriers in migration corridors. I would say, and many of you may already have thought this, then you have development in parts of the Bighorn Basin, and including the gray bull, that's at a much lower density, has been around a long time. And I think it would be harder to see, dramatic responses to that, although I haven't, studied it directly yet. I suspect fences are much more influential than we've yet been able to document and quantify, partly because fencing has been so extensive and so dense for so long that we we don't know what we're comparing, you know, that it's hard for us to identify the effect because the effect's already pervasive. So that might be really important in some areas. Residential development in other parts of the system, really important. And so I would point to those, but then again, I would say, you know, it's really context dependent as to what kind of effect, and what type of behavior is induced and what the costs of that are to these migratory populations.
And then the last question is, if you could wave a wand and pass one law to protect migratory routes in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, what would that law be?
Oh, law, gosh. Well, I'm glad I don't have to do that, first of all. And hats off to people that really have to sit in that role of the decision maker and the legislator and the executive who, you know, need to think about those. I mean, I think that one, you know, if funding were not, you know, limiting, I guess I would want to see a lot of investment, and it is right now, right? I mean, we're not only is funding always limiting, but now we're in the COVID world, and we're in the world where Wyoming and some other states are really suffering, you know, from declining revenues and from multiple directions. So, but in a world with less limits on funding, I would be really interested in sort of incentives or, you know, habitat leasing kinds of possibilities, particularly for private landowners, where you know, I'm not necessarily saying that, and I even know many landowners would say, look, I don't need to be, you know, paid to do conservation, and I want to, you know, I care about wildlife, and, you know, but then there are some others where it's really a lot to ask to say, okay, have all these carnivores, have all these migratory ungulates, have all these corridors, and, you know, still do your business. And so they're going to have to decide, you know, to make trade-offs between their economic interests and wildlife. And so in those places, I wish we had a better way that the public could, or that the private sector, or that NGOs and the conservation community could essentially rent habitat and say, hey, you're providing a value that we're willing to pay for, and let's negotiate a rate at which you are going to, you know, keep space for these wildlife. So I guess I would really want to look at those kinds of, you know, it's voluntary, but that there's funding and support to conceive of some kind of agreement that is tailored to a particular, you know, landowner and time and place. And I would also want to see a lot more support to collaborative kind of watershed scale initiatives that really, you know, there's a lot of different players that need to be involved, but there's no one coordinator or one organization that can tie that together for the benefit of a particular, you know, landscape or wildlife population. So supporting those kinds of efforts. So I would be looking more for these kinds of supports for collaborative conservation and for, you know, smart ways of supporting, you know, landowners to do conservation. And maybe with one or two, sorry, I'll add, where there's really a bottleneck, where there's really going to be a major impact on a herd of a development, maybe looking at some regulatory approaches to those spaces, but being very cautious with the application of those kinds of tools that block or limit development.
And I don't see any other questions, so I think that's it.
Okay, well,
Thank you so much.
well, thank you for having me, and I hope there will be a reason to come when we can actually be together in person. So another time.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Thank you.